Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Resilient Health Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Darin Ingels, and joining me on the podcast today is Jenny Johnson. Jenny is a physical therapist by training, but also a functional medicine health coach and has specific expertise in our topic today, this thing called CIRS, C-I-R-S. So we're going to do a deep dive in CIRS and biotoxin and mold illness today. So Jenny, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, Dr. Ingels.
Well, I know you have your own story, which kind of got you into the field. Again, I think it's always really interesting for people to know, again, kind of understanding why, you have your motivation of doing what you do. Can you just tell us a little bit about kind of what happened with you and your family?
Sure. And I'll try to keep it brief because I know, most of us who've been through a chronic illness, there's like the 2-minute version and then there's the 2-day version, and I'll spare you from the latter, but try to keep it to the higher level points. I was living on a little homestead, an organic homestead in North Georgia with my family. We had actually relocated from the suburbs. We wanted to live off the land and grow our own food and have animals and have solar and a well, all of it. We called it the grand experiment. And we just wanted to see if we could live closer to the land. And we did. And so we rehabbed this section of land in a parcel that we purchased in North Georgia that had a little kind of rickety cabin on it. We thought that's fine. Our kids are little and, it'll be kind of cute and quaint. We'll live in the little cabin and we'll turn this land into an organic farmstead and learn how to grow our food. Long story short, we learned the hard way that our genetics and all of the critters and invisible microbes and things living on that land did not get along very well. So my husband contracted Lyme disease, acute Lyme disease, fairly early on in our journey as he was out there clearing land and knocking down trees and just out there in the woods. And he would come in. We would all do tick checks every night, and we usually found them. He also found a bullseye rash one day, and it turned into all the acute Lyme disease symptoms that many of us are familiar with, like fever and chills, body aches, headaches. He started going through Lyme treatment and kind of plateaued with that. So eventually, after about 3 years of Lyme treatment, he was on disability and pretty much bedbound. We did not know at the time that our house was riddled with mold. We didn't see it. Nobody does. It's all like in the ducts or behind the walls, under the sinks. It looked cute from the outside, outside looking in. But it was not cute in the, behind the scenes, behind the walls. And we did not know that my husband's genetics are such that actually 24% of the population have similar genetics, but we don't recognize and tag biotoxins properly. And so then we can't eliminate them from our body like the other 76% of the population can. And so his genetics, he has what we call the multi-susceptible genetics. And so not only can he not recognize and eliminate mold or bacterial toxins properly, but even the toxins produced by Lyme spirochetes. So we soon learned that here was my husband on antibiotics for 3 years. Probably the Lyme disease was done with, but his body was recirculating Lyme toxins while he was breathing in bacteria and mold toxins and microbial VOCs and various other nasty critters that can be in water damaged buildings. And so he had some pretty rough symptoms. My son developed similar symptoms. I developed similar symptoms. It was really kind of like we started to drop like flies. One person's condition necessitated some family conditions or changes that then triggered the next person, that then triggered the next person. And some of that was stress induced. But it turns out we all had the genetics. So I married somebody who was genetically susceptible. And so then our kids were too. And so all 4 of us ended up getting what we soon learned was called CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. That was years ago. That was about a decade ago that all of this began, actually before. And we have all fully recovered. We did have to move away from our homestead. There were too many ticks in the pasture. There were brown recluse spiders all over. We had a compost bin that we didn't know any better. We would, get pitchforks out and turn it without a mask. bacteria and mold and who knows whatever else kind of spewing into the air, chicken coop with straw and moldy feed, and our little cabin that had water damage. I mean, it was just everywhere. And so in order to get well, we made the choice to just go back to the suburbs and find a clean house and go through the process of detoxing and restoring the parts of our bodies that had gotten dysregulated. And we are now fully healthy. We have recovered 100% from CIRS and have maintained that despite having the genetics. And so I'm pretty passionate about sharing that this is a real thing. Pay attention to indoor air quality. It's a thing. And then B, it's treatable. And it is reversible. And even if you've been sick for years, maybe even decades, and you're just now finding this out, it can still be reversed. And I think that's really good news.
So tell us a little bit more about what is CIRS. What does that mean? I mean, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, is it an autoimmune disease? Is
Yeah.
it just an inflammatory condition? Can you explain a little bit about what it really is?
Yeah, good question. So this is a term that was coined, I believe, in the late 90s, maybe early 2000s by Dr. Richie Shoemaker. Chronic inflammatory response syndrome. That sounds kind of generic, and it sort of is, but it's also a really great description of what's happening. It is an inflammatory response that our body undertakes when there's a certain trigger. And for CIRS, that trigger is always a biotoxin. So there are other inflammatory conditions, certainly, that exist out there. Inflammation is so widespread in America, but not all of the triggers or the underlying causes for people's inflammation is a response to a biotoxin. But for people with CIRS, that is the distinguishing factor, that we are reacting to a biotoxin that can be from mold, bacteria. Water damaged buildings are 80% of the time the culprit for CIRS. So, and that's not just mold. So it's not just a toxicity issue of mycotoxins. It's degrading man-made building materials that off-gas various VOCs that can be chemical in nature, biological in nature, um, microbial VOCs, beta glucans, hemolysins, bacterial endotoxins, mycotoxins. There are about 30 to 40 different agents in a water damaged building that can cause CIRS that are all considered biotoxins. And then I mentioned Lyme toxins. There are dinoflagellates, like the agents in the ocean that are responsible for red tide or brown tide, toxins produced by blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, such as microcystis or microcystin. Brown recluse spider bites have toxins that are considered biotoxins. So a biotoxin, you can probably get the theme here. It's a toxin produced by something alive, like a plant or an animal, rather than just a chemical or maybe a food or another trigger that could trigger, maybe something like MCAS. So when somebody who has a genetic susceptibility, and most people with CIRS do have a genetic susceptibility, though not all of us, when our gene is triggered or primed by some kind of priming event, so this is a modifiable gene, something triggers that into a full expression. Sometimes that's a really big exposure. Sometimes that's a trauma or a stressful event. Sometimes it's another inflammatory agent, like we get COVID or Epstein-Barr or something else, or Lyme disease, which turns this gene on or upregulates it, I'll say. And now we are no longer able to properly recognize and tag biotoxins. So we can be completely normal, living in a water damaged building as a kid, no big deal. We get COVID or we get Epstein-Barr or, mono, or we have a car accident or we get pregnant and have a kid. And maybe it's a tough pregnancy. Something switches in our body, which upregulates this gene that had been in the down position. And now all of a sudden, we're not tolerating our home. Whatever was there is now making us sick. It's because we can no longer eliminate those mold toxins or bacterial toxins without the help of a binder until that gene is silenced. So the way our body responds to this, our adaptive immune system, the part that's supposed to make antibodies, is not working properly. But our innate immune system, the part that pumps out generalized inflammation, is on overdrive. So we inhale these toxins. We can't remove them by creating antibodies, but instead our body just creates a bunch of inflammation, thinking, let's kill this thing. Let's get rid of the foreign invader. Something's here that's not supposed to be. But mycotoxins aren't alive or dead. They can't be killed. So the inflammation doesn't really hurt them, doesn't do anything at all. It just hurts our body. So in that sense, it's similar to an autoimmune condition where it's our body's response that is the problem. What's different between SIRS and an autoimmune condition is we are not actually fighting our own cells or a portion of our own body. We are fighting a toxin. There is an antigen, something that's not us, but we just can't kill it and we can't remove it. And so the inflammation becomes chronic, hence the term chronic inflammatory response syndrome. There's a cascade of events, as our cytokines keep pumping out inflammation, it causes further dysregulations and disruptions in other body systems, hormones and gut and all kinds of things. It cause secondary complications in our lungs, causes neuroinflammation, which leads to all kinds of nasty symptoms. So it's not just inflammatory, but it turns into more of a metabolic and even endocrine issue over time.
So, I mean, I know the symptoms tend to be not vague, but I mean, they overlap with a lot of other different
Yeah.
conditions. It'd be very easy to overlook it. How would someone necessarily know if they're dealing with SIRS relative to some of these other conditions?
Yeah, great question. So there's actually diagnostic criteria. There's a formal case definition that the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, accredited towards Shoemaker's work, SIRS. But then there's formal diagnostic criteria based on that case definition. So there are actual lab biomarkers. But before even doing labs, we look at symptoms. And so, but like you said, symptoms, there's a lot of crossover with other things. We're talking about fatigue. That's probably number one for people with SIRS. Extreme weakness. So, in addition to sleepiness and tiredness, fatigue, there's a body weakness, a muscle weakness, body pain, dizziness, anxiety, gut issues, ice pick pain, excessive urination. That's kind of an interesting one. Electric shocks, that's another interesting one. There's just all kinds of different. It's a multi-system and multi-system, multi. I'm forgetting that. Forgive me. I'm forgetting the sentence right now. But it impacts multiple symptoms. So it's not just GI or just skin
Right.
or just brain. It's really all of it. Multi-symptom, multi-system. That's what I was going for. But if we go through the systems, there's actually a symptom cluster chart that Dr. Shoemaker created where he aggregated certain symptoms, forgive me, in different sections, in different clusters. And if a patient looks at that cluster and they can determine, okay, I have at least one symptom in that cluster, one symptom in that cluster, one symptom in that cluster, if they have 8 or more positive clusters, and there are 13 total, then that has actually, then they've got to do a second part. So that's part one, symptom assessment. Part two is a visual contrast sensitivity test. And this is a test that they can do online. It costs like $15. That in itself, if we fail it in either eye, has a 92% accuracy rate for SIRS. But when we combine it with the symptom clusters, if you're failing this visual contrast sensitivity test, which is different than visual acuity, and we combine that with the results of the symptom clusters, that actually has a 98.5% correlation with the more formal diagnostic criteria, which is looking at labs. So there are certain cytokines and hormones. There's a classic picture of SIRS. If you can't just do one lab or two labs, you've got to do at least 5 or 6 because the formal diagnostic criteria necessitates 3. So 3 dysregulated labs plus the symptoms consistent with SIRS plus known or expected exposure. And then you don't have to fail the VCS test. I think about 8% of people have SIRS and don't fail it, but that's another piece to the puzzle.
Well, I know it's a complicated issue, and I know there's a lot of different tests that people can do. Um, the tests sometimes get hard to get your practitioner to order. Sometimes insurance doesn't cover it. I know that can be complicated in of itself if you're not
Yeah.
working with a provider who kind of understands the landscape
Yeah.
of how all this works. But kind of skipping ahead to that, I mean, again, I think that gets into a lot more detail than we probably have time for here today. But definitely, if this is something you think you're dealing with, get in the hands of a practitioner who understands this.
Yeah.
But beyond that, if people are dealing with this, what everyone really wants to know is, what do we do about it?
Yeah.
Obviously, if you're living in a moldy environment, getting out of that environment or remediating the home or wherever the
Yeah.
property is always the best option. But beyond that, once you've had that exposure, what else can we do once that exposure's happened to kind of go what you've been through? And, how do you help overcome this kind of illness?
Yeah. Well, you nailed it with really what you said first, getting out of exposure. And that's step one of the Shoemaker protocol, or really any protocol from any kind of practitioner who's addressing chronic low dose biotoxin exposure is going to want to look at your environment and address that first. Otherwise, if you start detoxing or treating symptoms, it's kind of like bailing water out of a boat with a leak. So, yeah, we've got to assess our environment. And there are a variety of ways to do that, and then address it. That's easier said than done. That can take people 6 months, a year, 6 years sometimes to even figure out, where am I getting exposed and how do I fix it? And then how do I keep it from coming back? So the exposure piece is huge. But once we are in what we call like a sanctuary or clean living, and there are certain standards for people who've been diagnosed with SIRS, there are certain environmental standards. Something called the Hertz Me Too test has been correlated with health outcomes. It's a dust sample that looks at that DNA of mold specifically. If we get a score of 10 or less on that test, on our home, it is associated with a 98.3% chance of recovering in that home. So that's our goal. A lot of SIRS doctors are saying we want you to get to that 10. It's not perfect, but it's something to go off of that's objective. And then that's when the binding starts. Binding can start while you're still trying to get out of exposure as well. But we need to take something that's going to help grab onto those toxins that our body is having a hard time eliminating naturally, and help to pull those out of our body through the stool. And so we start to take our binders. Sometimes it can help to facilitate detox pathways, make sure we're not constipated. We can do some sweating. We can do some Epsom salt baths. Sometimes that's dumping out other toxins that our body is holding on to that can also just clog up our system. So we're not certain that biotoxins can come out in a variety of ways. We know through the stool, but all of it helps. If we're toxic, we just need to help our system be less toxic, empty that bucket. A lot of people start to feel a whole lot better once they're out of exposure and then they've started to pull those toxins out. Our body wants to find homeostasis. It wants to put itself back together again. But sometimes it does that in kind of like, I call it the cha-cha, like 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. There's sort of fits and spurts that our body goes through as it's trying to find normal again. And sometimes it's an ugly path and it doesn't feel linear. And it's very personalized, I would say. How people then go through the next steps really depends on their symptoms, their labs, what else might be going on. Sometimes there are additional gut infections or food intolerances or hormone dysregulations, thyroid issues that I believe, can be totally separate or can be secondary complications from just a dysregulated system, that where the SIRS could maybe be the root of, but our body just needs a little help putting those pieces back together. So it's very personalized after the getting out of exposure and then pulling out the binders. I mean, I'm sorry, pulling out the toxins with the binders.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big problem I run into with a lot of my patients here in California, and I'm sure it's not unique to California, but people find out they have particularly, water damage in their home. They move, they go to an apartment, they find a temporary place,
Mhm.
and the place they went's just as bad as the place they left.
Yes. Oh, I know. It's
Construction here
awful.
is built so poorly that, especially in the last 2 years, we've had a lot of rain in California. So everything here leaks like a sieve when it does rain. And so, when people move their environments and say, gosh, I don't feel any better, we don't necessarily know unless you've tested that the environment you went into isn't any better than the one you left.
Right.
So I know that this can be really frustrating and challenging for folks. And I know part of your work is you've really created a community around SIRS. How important is it really for people to get a sense of community in all this?
I think it's huge. So many people who've been diagnosed with SIRS or who think they just may have SIRS have been gaslit by doctors who say, no, that's not a thing, or there's not a test that proves that. Their family members living with them may not be symptomatic. And so they say, I think maybe there's something else going on. This, if our house was bad, we'd all be feeling it. So there are a lot of reasons for those things, but a lot of people going through this feel very alone. And then that's a secondary complication to further disorder. Loneliness is pathological, and it can cause physiological problems and emotional problems that are obstacles to healing. So I think when we can reduce that loneliness, normalize this, validate for people who are already in it, and create that sense of community, it's kind of like, I'm not crazy. And there's this letdown process of relief that I see people when they connect with each other and realize, okay, this it's in my head, but it's not in my head, right? It's neurological and it's neuroinflammatory, but I'm not making it up and I'm not crazy. And then there's the sharing of information too. So many of us are kind of in silos with our own experience. We have our doctor, we have the research we've done, we have our experience, but most of us are making mistakes along the way, and those are costly mistakes. And then eventually we learn a way that works. And when we can pool that information with each other and share with some of the newer folks just coming into this community, hey, here's what worked for me. Here's what ended up being a pitfall. Here's, what ended up being really helpful. We can decrease that treatment duration for people, which can be really extended if we are all falling off, into the ditch on that same journey, without the right information. So I think information sharing is the other piece to the community that's so important.
Yeah, I want to play devil's advocate for a second because I've run into this in the Lyme community, running a Facebook page
Mm,
and in community networks. How do you how do you moderate in a way that people get good, reliable information? Because I know we're all jaded by our own experience. And I've seen this, certainly on Facebook pages where people will start to belittle, berate other people
I
for not
know.
doing the thing they did. And,
Right.
well, you need to be seeing this doctor. You need to be doing this treatment.
Yeah.
Everyone's journey and experience can be very different.
Yeah.
So, how do you, I guess, herd cats in a way that
Yeah.
it helps people move forward without that obstacle of getting, hate to say, misinformation. It's different information, or maybe
Yeah.
someone's own personal experience.
Yeah, I think that's so true, and I'm glad you brought that up. There are maybe healthy communities that are professionally facilitated or moderated in such a way that we can kind of redirect comments that may be one-offs, or hey, that's just your experience. Do you have any literature or research to back up what you just said, or is that just your experience? If that's just your experience, could you please state that this was your experience and not
Right.
something that's, evidence-based? Because experiences is how we learn. But when we become dictatorial about our experience, that's not okay. We need to say, hey, here's what worked for me. It may or may not work for you. But I think when a community is professionally facilitated by somebody who has time to do that, we can curate an experience that is a little bit safer and more streamlined. It's not perfect. We're all hurting and we all do have different experiences, different bodies. One of the things that I think is favorable about my community in particular is it is specific to CIRS. And I would say because I'm a shoemaker proficiency partner and a CIRS coach in that niche, the majority of the people in my community do identify as that niche. So I have CIRS and I'm on the shoemaker protocol. And so we are all speaking the same language. We're all doing the same labs. And one of the things I really appreciate about the shoemaker protocol is there's always ongoing research. They're never saying, hey, here's a good idea. Let's do this. It's let's do research around that, at least get some statistics saying enough people are responding in this way before we go tell people to do X, Y, or Z. It can be a little less cutting edge that way, but it is more evidence based. And so we're all following kind of the same evidence, the same structure, and speaking the same language. And so I think that's helpful. We could miss some things. So sometimes, it's nice to have other people come in saying, "Hey, there's some people doing a little differently over here." I try to stay open minded. I'm involved with various professional organizations that are looking at this from different lenses. But I think that's helpful for a community to have a smaller niche so that we share that language, if that makes sense.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the kind of community built and kind of the programs that you offer for folks.
Yeah. Well, so I used to work with people one-on-one. I still do, but that's how I started as a shoemaker coach, if you will. And then I realized that people were asking the same questions, having similar experiences, and all feeling really alone. And so I suggested to a handful of my clients early on, hey, do you want to do this in a group? I think you'd really get along with so and so. You're asking some similar questions and you both have kids and I think you'd be friends, kind of wanting to kind of set up that camaraderie. And so I tried that with kind of my first host of clients. Let's do this together. And it was cost effective for people who are looking for ways of cutting costs because, environmental illnesses cost a lot of money. And it was more fun. And again, when there was a small group and it was professionally facilitated and we had some ground rules, we're not going to do this, we are going to do that. We had to be clear about our ground rules. It was really cool. I ended up building a systematic educational program. Every time we met, we were talking about a certain topic. And then the next time we met, we would build on the previous topic and go one level deeper. And we kind of, by the end of 12 sessions together, we all became best friends. Like people swapped their information, wanted to stay in contact, but we had kind of gone through a deep dive. And how do we get through this? What are all the things that we don't know that we don't know? So that first group went so well. They all wanted to stay in touch. So I built a community, kind of like actually it was originally a Facebook group. And I kept doing these educational groups of maybe 6 to 10 people in these systematic educational group coaching cohorts. And then they would graduate and they would go into the community, the Facebook group. I do another group, they go into the Facebook group. The Facebook group, we wanted to make it more private, a little more professional. So we moved it to a more private platform and it now has about 400 people in it. But it is still has that small group feel where there's hope and encouragement and kindness rather than my situation's worse than yours, or you're doing it wrong, or you've got to, there's a vibe, I think, because most people have maybe gone through the educational cohort first and then moved into the community. We're here to get well, not to compete with each other or to trigger each other or to dump our trauma on each other. We can do that in certain ways, but not to trigger each other. And so I'm blessed. I'm very grateful that the community has just turned into what it has. It just is beautiful. Part education, part support, but lots of hope and lots of kindness.
Well, that's what we need more in the world, right? We
Yeah,
need someone help to lift each other up and not tear each other down. And certainly for anyone who's struggled with chronic illness, you know what it's like.
yeah,
And I'm sure anyone who's been in that game long enough has had the experience of somebody, family, friend, medical
yeah,
professional, like I said, just kind of not work in their favor. So it's great that
yeah,
you've built this community of people, like-minded individuals who really are there to help support each other, grow, and ultimately heal and get well. So we're going
yeah.
to drop a link in the show notes to your website. If people are really interested in wanting to work with you and be part of your community, we'd love to invite people to take advantage of that because I know you're a wealth of information. You've been doing this for a long time. You've helped a lot of people recover, and I just really appreciate you spending time with me today and sharing all this great information. So thank you so much for being on the show, Jenny.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.